Okay, everyone, I'm going to take a slightly different tack here. I thought that hearing another analysis around sort of what the costs and benefits around the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management or the latest revisions might not be sort of something you would like to hear. We did do some of that analysis, and we did it in the Ruamahanga catchment. And interestingly, when you look at what sort of came out in terms of the actual final decisions, we actually did manage to model a lot of the things that they'd asked for. But instead, I really wanted to sort of get people to start thinking a little bit more about beyond freshwater policy and the kind of analysis that we as economists need to undertake. And I think Tim alluded to that at the end of his talk, where he sort of said we don't really know how some of the responses and impacts actually sort of will be driven also by climate policy or impacted by climate policy. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit around the value of actually addressing multiple environmental issues within the same analysis and those policy directions. Okay, sorry guys, I'm trying to get to the next slide. So if you actually think about what New Zealand is facing at the moment in terms of environmental policy directions, it's quite substantial. And if you're sitting in the sort of the land use sector, meaning the agricultural and the forestry sector, this is the kinds of stuff that you're seeing. We have the NPS for freshwater management and its implementation. It did come out in 2011, but there's been several revisions since then, and there's been quite a few changes in direction if you look over that period of time. We also have the Zero Carbon Bill, which was actually passed into law last year. And then we've got the ETS. And when you think about the ETS, there has been over a decade of conversations around if, when, and how agriculture would be incorporated into the ETS. And of course, that's changed as governments have changed as well. We've had the 1 billion trees program that was launched at the end of 2018. We have the National Environmental Standard for Plantation Forestry, which became operational in 2018. And some of those impacts or requirements won't actually go into place until the next rotation. So there is quite a long lag time around the full implementation or getting up to speed with the NES. And of course, most recently this month, we've got the New Zealand Biodiversity Strategy. And what that strategy is going to do is provide the strategic direction for the protection, restoration, and also the sustainable use of biodiversity, and in particular Indigenous biodiversity. And what was really interesting about the launch of that particular strategy was the recognition and the emphasis placed on private lands and how Indigenous biodiversity in private lands is going to be really important to achieving the goals of that strategy. So we have lots of things coming at us in New Zealand, and this is what basically the agricultural and forestry sector will be actually seeing. But we actually typically look at these policies in isolation. And this is probably because that's how government sees it, and this is the request they ask of us. But increasingly, we're starting to hear government make slightly different noises in that particular space. So I want to just sort of run you through some things that we've done in this particular space. And the first thing I wanted to sort of point out was at the end of last year, we were asked by MFE to look at sort of, what would be the impact of the joint climate and freshwater policy. And not surprising, but a little disappointing, when we looked across the academic literature, central government reports that have been commissioned, and also some of the larger regional councils, in terms of analyses that had looked at both climate and freshwater policy at the same time, there was only 7 of them. Then there was about 30 other policies, sort of analyses that had that were related but not particularly relevant. And these looked at the effect of climate policy on freshwater indicators, and that is one of the reports that Tim actually used. There's also about 7 on the effect of freshwater policy on climate indicators, and then there's a whole bunch on land management, on the effect of land management and different options for land management on freshwater and climate indicators. And I'd like to acknowledge that the 2 authors of that report are actually on this call, so if there's any really gnarly questions, I'm sure I can ask those guys to also help answer that question. But when you start thinking about the fact that most of the analysis is only done on isolated policies rather than joint policies, it's important to start to think about, well, does it actually matter? And so I'm going to just sort of run through two of the analyses that had been undertaken by us at Manaaki Whenua, and just show you sort of why I think we need to be doing more work in this particular space. So this is an example of some work that was done by Adam Dagno, myself, and Oshri Samarasinha a couple of years ago. It's looking at joint policy of carbon pricing and nutrient reduction targets. It is a little bit older, so it doesn't reflect necessarily where we went to in this current revision of the NPS, but certainly in earlier iterations of the NPS, reduction targets were on the table. I'm only going to sort of show a subset of the analyses as well, because it's just too much to show on one slide. But in terms of the policies that we did look at, we looked at a carbon price, and the carbon price there was a $10, $20 and $30 a tonne per tonne of carbon dioxide. And this was both, you know, being landowners paying for their greenhouse gas emissions, but also getting a payment for the carbon they sequester. And the other was looking at nitrogen reduction targets. And again, we looked at a 10, 20 and 30% reduction. And I'm just going to show you here the interplay between the $20 per tonne and the 20% reduction target. So if you go to the analysis at the bottom, what you'll see if you just look at the greenhouse gas emissions is that when you actually consider both policies at the same time, you actually get a far greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions than if you looked at the policies in isolation. And before anybody asks the question, yes, I do realise that there is actually a greater reduction in greenhouse gas emissions under the 20% nitrogen reduction target. And that's primarily because the signal sent and the degree of change that's required to achieve that 20% target across the country provides a far greater land use change signal than the $20 per tonne. So that is also something that's really interesting that comes out with some of these kinds of analyses. Similarly, when you look at the nitrogen leaching, you do also see that under a joint policy signal, you get a greater reduction in nitrogen leaching than if you just look at the single policy of having a 20% reduction in nitrogen. So it starts to tell you at the national level, yes, it does actually make a difference if we start looking at policies jointly and the types of signals that they send. With this particular analysis, we're also able to look at sort of the impacts at a regional scale. And when you look at the screen, because I'm assuming you're all looking at a screen, on the far left-hand side, you've got the scenario where it's only the carbon price in place. The middle sort of map is where there's a nitrogen reduction target in place, and then the far right is where both policies are in operation. And what you do see is there's quite a different impact in terms of farm revenue across the entire country. And that, for example, if you look at farm revenue just under a nitrogen cap or a nitrogen target, you'll see that there's actually a negative impact on farm revenue in all the regions. However, if you actually pair that or think about this in terms of what is a joint signal that would be coming from both a carbon price and also the nitrogen reduction target, you do actually get some benefits in some of the regions where you will actually get an increase in farm revenue. So those spatial impacts and spatial variation really matters. And I think that sort of gets to the crux of what Santiago was also saying, where around, you know, the implications of these policies will definitely have a regional variation, and we need to consider those. Similarly, when we start looking at the impacts on net greenhouse gas emissions, we have a similar kinds of stories and implications that come through. And so in this particular one, if you take a look at that middle map at the top there, this is the impacts of just having a nitrogen reduction target in place. And what you'll see is in certain regions, you actually get an increase in greenhouse gas emissions. And so this is because of again, because of land use change, which is something that Tim noted that drives a lot of these kinds of models. But when you actually pair both the nitrogen reduction target alongside the climate policy again, what you do is you get an overall decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. So you're starting to see the benefits again of looking at both policies and understanding what the interactions are between those two policies. Looking at the impacts on nitrogen leaching, again, you have a similar kind of story. As when you start to look at the impacts of both policies, you see that the degree of reduction is much higher, or not much higher, but is higher than a standalone policy around nitrogen in some of the regions. And so you see that in terms of Southland and also the top of the South, and also parts of the eastern side of the North Island. So this starts to sort of paint a picture that actually when you look at policies in isolation, you don't necessarily get the right information, the right signals or the right kinds of impacts that you expect to see if you, compared to if you've got multiple policies operating. The other example I'd like to show is some work that was done late last year where we were asked to look at what is the impact of multiple policies on greenhouse gas emissions. And I'd like to say we did this on freshwater, but that was not possible, primarily due to the data sort of issues around that. But I still think that it provided some really interesting observations and evidence of why we should start thinking about these things a little bit differently. So in terms of the policies that were considered in this particular analysis, it was pricing agricultural biological greenhouse gas emissions. And these, we looked at a range of prices here. We looked at $30, $40 and $50 a tonne. There was the ETS for forestry, again at the same prices. We had the National Environmental Standard for plantation forestry, and the intervention we modelled there was the riparian setback across all forested land. And as I mentioned earlier in the talk, a lot of this won't come into place until the next rotation. We looked at the NPS of freshwater management, and this was of course done before the current package has been rolled out. But we did look at, the intervention we looked at here was a 5 metre and a 30 metre buffer. And then 1 billion trees was another program, and we looked at 400,000 hectares of new forested area. One scenario was pines only, and the other scenario was a mix of pines and native trees. And then of course, there was a combination of all those policies. So just to show you what the, results of that are, and again, I'm only going to show you just a small portion of those. And so I'm just showing you here what is the $40 per tonne carbon price, the 5 metre buffer for the NPS, because that's the closest to the 3 metres that is actually in the NPS, the 5 metre setback for the NES plantation forestry, and then the mixed pine and native with the 5 metre setback for 1 billion trees, and then the joint policy of all of those. And again, what you see is that when you start to look at what the impacts of the combined climate, environmental and forestry policy, you do get a much greater reduction in general in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but you also get a much greater reduction in net revenue or farm income in this particular case. But what is interesting to note here is if you look at the NPS of freshwater management, the 5 metre buffer, the net revenue changes or reduction is 23% in 2030 versus a only 22% in the combined policy. And similarly in 2050, there's about a 7% difference. So there are benefits, again, of looking at combined policies and what those combined policies tell you compared to looking at individual policies or policies in isolation. So just in conclusion, I would just sort of wanted to say, you know, when you start looking at environmental policies in isolation, what you kind of miss and you don't capture is the incentives sent by other policies, and those incentives can be really powerful sometimes. And so therefore you're likely to underestimate the degree or level of environmental improvement, but also the costs that might be associated with those. Most of our modelling has looked at those costs in terms of net farm revenue. But then when you turn to the farmer side of things, what do farmers actually see? They see all policies and policy signals that are coming from government and regional councils. So that's how they're making their decisions. And, you know, we've done quite a lot of working with farmers, either in sort of workshop situations or helping, sort of running participatory processes. And the last two that we've run have been in the Bay of Plenty and in Waikato. And in those processes, farmers never talk about a single policy. They talk about the range of policies that are coming their way and how in the heck that they're going to deal with those and what are the best management practices and decisions that they can make in the face of all those policies. And of course, we've now got biodiversity slipping into the limelight as well. So we really do need to think about how that additional potential future policy driver is going to affect the decisions that farmers make. And we need to build those into our policy analysis. So I guess what I'm sort of saying is that going forward, we should all make a play to try and incorporate the range of environmental and potentially some of the other policies that are being developed into the decisions and the advice that we provide to government and regional councils. Of course, there's always going to be that 800-pound gorilla in the room, and the challenge that I see for a lot of us that do this kind of work is having reliable data across all the environmental parameters that we're interested in and all sectors. At a national level, we've got very disjointed, disconnected data sets that make it quite difficult to have confidence that our analysis really holds across all the regions. Some of the regions have really quite good data, but of course the challenge that we've got with quite good data in a region now is that in a couple of years' time that data might be out of date. So just to reiterate, there is also quite a lot of work that I think we need to do as economists to get really good financial information, but also complementary environmental information to help us support these kinds of analysis going forward. And with that, I will leave it.